Hey Bio20s, Mr. Malik couldn't make it here today, so I'm here to talk to you about gas exchange in the respiratory system. I thought I'd warm things up a little bit with some jokes. So what is a skeleton's favorite musical instrument? The trombone. What do skeletons say when they head out to sea? Bon voyage. And who won the skeleton beauty contest? Nobody. All right, I think I'll take it from here. Thanks for your help. So, as he was saying, we will be talking about gas exchange today, and we're going to be talking about specifically oxygen transport and carbon dioxide transport in the human body. So according to Dalton's law of partial pressure, gases will always diffuse from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And this is very similar when we talk about diffusion, right? We're always going high to low concentration, high to low pressure. If we look at gases in different areas, let's start down here in the atmosphere. So notice how the atmosphere, in terms of partial pressure, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is much higher than the partial pressure of oxygen in your tissues. And there's a reason for this. Gases are going to diffuse from the atmosphere. You breathe them in through your trachea, and they're going to end up in your alveoli. If these words are things that you've forgotten, feel free to watch the previous video on the structures of the respiratory system to give you a better understanding on what each of these structures do. Then from the alveoli, oxygen is going to diffuse into the arteries and the veins and eventually into the tissues in your body. So it's always going from an area of high pressure to low pressure. Then if we look at carbon dioxide, which is in purple here, carbon dioxide is going to go in the opposite direction, where we're going to go from an area of higher pressure in your tissues, because as we know, a waste product of cell respiration is carbon dioxide, diffuse into your blood, veins, and arteries, then into your alveoli, trachea, and then eventually into the atmosphere. So we're going to talk about those two processes. One, how does oxygen get from our atmosphere into our tissues? And two, how does carbon dioxide get out of our tissues and then ultimately into the atmosphere? So let's start here with oxygen, right? What do we know about oxygen? Well, we know that oxygen is not very soluble in your blood. Oxygen is only about roughly 0.3 milliliters for every 100 milliliters of blood, which is really insoluble. So then the question is, well, how do we get oxygen to actually stay in your blood? And we need at least 10 times that amount to survive. So what are we going to do to actually make that oxygen stay in our blood? Because it doesn't want to, right? Oxygen and blood, they don't mix very well. So here's what we need. We need something called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a very special molecule attached to your red blood cells. Now your red blood cells, they're little kind of like disc shapes within your blood. They look like little donuts without the center cut out, and they are full of hemoglobin. Now hemoglobin is a special molecule that can bind with oxygen, and what it does is it increases the oxygen carrying capacity from 0.3 per 100 milliliters to 20 per 100 milliliters. So it increases the ability of blood to hold on to oxygen significantly. Now, when oxygen and hemoglobin combine, they form a compound called oxyhemoglobin. So oxygen plus hemoglobin gives you oxyhemoglobin. So this would be oxygen bound to hemoglobin within those red blood cells. So let's take a look here. Here's what a red blood cell looks like. Oxygen from the lungs is going to diffuse into the blood plasma and then bind to these little red discs, these red blood cells. And it's the job of these hemoglobin molecules to bind to that oxygen. Now, another element that's involved here would be iron, right? So to have oxygen and hemoglobin function properly together, you'll need iron. So later on we'll talk about anemia and what that means and why someone who doesn't eat a lot of iron might be tired. So hemoglobin would then bind with oxygen with the help of iron, of course, and then it will be carried along through the bloodstream until it reaches, say, a muscle tissue, a brain tissue, a heart tissue, and then what's going to happen is the oxygen is going to be released from the hemoglobin and then diffuse into the cell. So that's oxygen's journey. Pretty straightforward. Going to diffuse from your respiratory system, from the alveoli, into the capillaries, into the bloodstream, bind to hemoglobin in your red blood cells, and eventually be transported to your tissues. So nice and easy. Unfortunately, carbon dioxide transport is a little more difficult. So let's wrap our heads around this. Carbon dioxide wants to move from the tissue to the blood, to the alveoli, and eventually to the atmosphere. But remember, gases always travel from the area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. So here's the issue. The issue is that when CO2 diffuses into your blood, if the pressure gets too high, it'll just go back into your tissue. So we need to maintain a low partial pressure of CO2 in the blood to allow for CO2 to continue to diffuse from your body tissues. And here's how that's done. Number one, some CO2 will diffuse into your blood, but majority of it will actually combine with water to form a compound known as carbonic acid. By forming carbonic acid in your blood, what you're actually doing is keeping the partial pressure of CO2 low in the blood so it can continue to diffuse from the tissue into your blood. So most CO2 will just combine with water to form carbonic acid. Now, this actual reaction involves a special enzyme. It's called carbonic anhydrase. So carbonic anhydrase will speed up this chemical reaction, converting CO2 and water into carbonic acid. And this ultimately decreases the amount of CO2 in your plasma, which allows lower partial pressure and continues the diffusion of CO2 into the blood. So that's awesome. All right, problem solved. Not so much. Because now, yes, we have low partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, but what do we do with the carbonic acid? Right? We still have to get it out, right? We still have to get it into, like, CO2 into our lungs and then eventually into the atmosphere. So this would be stage 2 in the process. What's going to happen here is the carbonic acid is going to break down into bicarbonate ions and H+ ions. Now, we discussed how kidneys can act as a buffer, right? Releasing H+ or getting rid of H+. Same kind of idea. Your blood and in turn your hemoglobin can actually act as a buffer. So when that oxyhemoglobin arrives at a cell, what happens is there's a switch. So what happens is the oxygen is kicked out of the hemoglobin by the H+ ions. So the H+ ions will come along, and I can draw this out for you real quick. So here's our red blood cell. Let's say there's an oxygen molecule in our red blood cell, right? It's going to come along. It's riding the bus right now, and in comes along H+. H+ is going to kick out the oxygen, and then the O2 is going to go to your body tissue. So that could be a muscle, heart, whatever it ends up being. So now the H+ is going to be bound to the hemoglobin, and it's going to form a compound. So it's going to form a compound with the hemoglobin. Now, we have our H+ dislodging the oxygen, and now we have a compound called reduced hemoglobin. So to recap here, when oxygen is bound with hemoglobin, we refer to that as oxyhemoglobin. When H+ or hydrogen ions are bound to hemoglobin, we refer to that as reduced hemoglobin. So now what's going to happen? Well, that reduced hemoglobin is going to travel to the alveoli travel to the capillaries surrounding your alveoli. Once there, we're going to have the reverse happen. So now we're going to have our red blood cell with H+. Oxygen is going to come in, kick out the H+, and now H+ is going to be floating around in the blood, specifically the blood in the capillaries surrounding your alveoli. So finally that H+ is going to recombine with bicarbonate ions to make, you guessed it, CO2 and water. Now we have a high concentration of CO2 in the capillaries surrounding your alveoli. Where do you think it's going to go? Well, if you guessed into the alveoli and into the respiratory system, you would be correct. So now the CO2 is going to diffuse into your alveoli. It's then going to be pushed out of your trachea and eventually expelled from the body. And that is the process of releasing CO2 from your tissues. So just as a quick recap for everybody, right? Oxygen transport I find quite simple to explain. It's always high to low, right? Oxygen binding with hemoglobin, transporting to the cells, diffusing into the cells. Here's what's happening with CO2. First, we need to make carbonic acid. Why? Because it keeps the partial pressure of CO2 low in the blood. Next, that carbonic acid is going to break down into bicarbonate and H+. Now, we don't want the blood getting too acidic, so what we do is we remove the H+ by dislodging oxygen from hemoglobin, and we eventually form reduced hemoglobin with the hemoglobin and the H+. Finally, the reduced hemoglobin will make its way to its lungs. There'll be another switch where the oxygen kicks off the H+, H+ recombines with hydrogen to form CO2 and water. Water obviously stays in the blood, CO2 diffuses into the lungs, and away we go. And here's just kind of an image of everything happening. So within your red blood cell and body tissue, CO2 converted into carbonic acid with the help of carbonic anhydrase. This then becomes bicarbonate and H+. H+ combines with HB, which is an abbreviation for hemoglobin, which forms reduced hemoglobin. Then, when we get to the lungs, the H+ is removed from the hemoglobin, recombines with bicarbonate, then eventually forms water and CO2. CO2 diffuses into the alveoli and then is removed to the respiratory system. So that's it today for gas exchange in the respiratory system. Feel free to rewind this video if you need to go over any of the parts. Two key takeaways: how does oxygen get into your cells, and how does CO2 get out of your cells? So thanks for watching, and we'll chat soon.